we move on to Dr. Tremmel. My toughest under-expanded stent. IVL called to the rescue. Let's see how that works out.
Thank you. Thank you. I want to thank Roxana and the other directors for inviting me. It's really a pleasure to be here. These are my disclosures. So this is a 48-year-old man who basically had everything: hypertension, hyperlipidemia, type 2 diabetes, tobacco use, obese, and a family history of heart disease. And his family history is quite impressive. His brother had sudden cardiac death at 42. Another brother had CABG at 53, and a sister had PCI at 55. So he originally presented to an outside hospital with an NSTEMI in 2017 at the age of 43 and had PCI to his LAD and his right coronary artery. And then more recently, he had come to our hospital with unstable angina. He ruled out for an MI and had a stress echo showing apical ischemia. So if you look at his right coronary artery, he had mild to moderate ISR in that mid. And then in the LAD, he has this kind of hazy looking ISR. And given, his presentation and area of ischemia, we figured this was the issue. So this is an underexpanded stent case, so you kind of know how this goes. We started with a 6 French XB4 guide from the left radial artery. We ballooned it with a 2.5 balloon, decided to try a cutting balloon, it wouldn't cross, put in a 3.0 NC balloon, tried the cutting balloon again, it wouldn't cross, took a 6 French guide extension so we had more support. To put in a 3.5 NC, this balloon ruptured, got a new 3.5 NC balloon, which dilated, tried the cutting balloon again, it wouldn't cross, thought maybe we should image it, IVUS wouldn't cross. So at this point, I told my fellow that I just needed a moment, and we decided that we would get ROTA, right? So we had to get across this to begin with, so this is a 1.5 burr, and then we post-dilated with a 3.5 NC balloon. And at this point, we were able to get IVUS in. So if you look here and you follow this along, what you're going to see is, despite the fact that we just rotaed, and you can see, that the rota has happened, that we still have very tight circumferential calcified lesion here. My fellow turned to me and he says, "Gosh, it seems like you're always cleaning up other people's messes." And this is basically somebody else's mess. And I think this is a good teaching moment. And one thing that I encourage my fellows is to not be a lazy interventionalist. We need to take the time to do these stents right so that we're not dealing with them later. So fortunately, we had shockwave, and so we put shockwave in there. We did all 80 pulses, and then we post-dilate with a 3.75 NC balloon. And then we IVUS again, right, to make sure that we've actually fractured the calcium. And so what you'll see as we pull back is that all the areas that are calcified now have at least 2 points of fracture. So now we're ready to put a stent in here. So we put in a 3.5 by 26 millimeter DES, post-dilate with a 4.0 NC balloon. We have an MSA of 7.9 when we do our final IVUS. So in conclusion, so even in stents that appear expanded angiographically, nearly a quarter of them are underexpanded. And 42% of our restenosis cases are due to stent underexpansion. So don't put in an underexpanded stent. That would be the conclusion from this case. So you must use intravascular imaging for lesion preparation and stent optimization, and in any case of stent failure to find out why it failed, so you understand the etiology and you know how to address it properly. And we also now have a lot of tools to ensure that we have optimal stent expansion, high pressure non-compliant balloons, cutting balloons, laser, rotational orbital atherectomy, and shockwave, so make sure you use them. Thank you very much.
All right, that was tremendous, and we'll come back to a similar subject later on. Let's invite stay in California faculty, Dr. Kearney, West Coast, I should say, faculty. My best cardiogenic shock case. What a save!
Okay, so while my disclosures are pulling up, I'll say that I chose this case from a couple years ago, actually, in part because I think it highlights the important aspects of that medicine is a team sport, and also that we're all a product of our training. So I think there's many points where you're going to think I'm absolutely nuts, and you're probably right. But that I think that heavily factors into some of the decision making, and that's one of the benefits of these conferences is learning from each other in different styles. So This is a 53-year-old gentleman. He had a 2-vessel CABG about 10 years prior and came in with acute onset chest pain. He'd actually been out, had admitted to some cocaine use, had crushing chest pain, and was driving himself to the hospital. He said, quote, "Then I crapped my pants and just decided that was the time to pull over and not drive himself to the hospital and call 911. But when he showed up, he was having a lateral ST, a lateral STEMI, and he was also in hypoxemic respiratory failure quite quickly, and this was his angiogram when he came to the lab intubated. Then we can see here he's got a culprit lesion of his vein graft. That's the graft supplying his OM circ territory. He has a patently limited LAD, diffuse disease in the RC that's not grafted, and basically a stump of his left main. He had a minimally elevated troponin on initial arrival, but was hypotensive in the cath lab there, and you can see in these angiograms here that he does have a balloon pump here by the end. So in summary, this is what we're dealing with in occlusion of the vein graft. I think there's obviously multiple options about whether just trying to go ahead and stent that because they had no flow. The operator at the other hospital thought there's so much clot there, I'm really worried about that. I put him on the balloon pump, briefly tried to wire the left main here, ran into trouble, so called my partner, Bill Lombardi, and said, hey, I have this case, I'm gonna send this guy to you. I think he might need his native vessel open, but is gonna be a little bit of a to-do. But Bill is actually getting on a plane to go to San Diego, so he said, hey, you're on call, I'm transferring you this case coming in at 4. So I was actually quite junior, and fortunately, at least we had a plan to kind of review the films and go through the plan some. But when I think about this also, and talking to fellows in these moments, planning for these uncomfortable scenarios and shock cases, I think the hard part is sometimes, one, you kind of want to run away. That's always some indication. But really, if the indication's very clear and you can make a plan, often with some help, and you think you can execute that, then really I think it's time to get busy. And it's more that if you're unclear about the strategy, you can call for help. And if they're not sure about the indication, then maybe we will decide to run away. But really, if all of those things point to that, I will say for myself, vein grafts interventions make me nervous. I didn't do a whole lot of them in interventional training. I had a lot more experience from the CTO side, but also because of the data that they have a high complication rate, and a lot of these issues are ones that are difficult to control. So we can put a filter wire down, we can give vasodilators, but a lot of the issues are actually a little bit out of our control. So his hemodynamics were actually much improved by the time he got to us. So he's on suppressors, but we're coming off of those. His trope is rising, not surprisingly. And so I think ultimately, just to cut to the chase, decided to leave the balloon pump in part because we're hopefully not messing with the vein graft much and not going to cause more reflow, and did decide to go ahead and just do the native. So I will say I was lucky at this first angiogram. You can see now we have some visualization of the vessel at least, and to some degree to do this now, I hope I would pause and maybe think a little bit more about the plan, but I bulldozed right ahead. So ultimately quite easy to get retrograde actually back to the left main. I was having a lot of trouble setting up for reverse cart, basically kept popping down that diag and having a hard time getting through the calcium to make those angles. Ultimately rotated into the diag antegrade, then we were able to get a balloon down. And I will say in this moment, my boss could have just bolted after his TAVR was done in the other room, but he came to check on me and kind of helped me set this up. It is one of those things of the first 3 challenges were okay, but you start to get fatigued, and I was unsure about whether I could get through this and should I switch strategies. And I think this was actually incredibly helpful in this moment. So we were able to flip retrograde and then just get our microcatheter out and snare that to externalize. And then it was just normal atherectomy and IVS guided PCI. I think overall, looking back on that, he improved quite quickly, but there was a lot more to the story. So he actually came back with pulmonary edema. We ended up treating the right. His LVDP was 40 at that time, so actually did put an Impella in to stabilize him overnight for that intervention. And ultimately, he still had really kind of sensitive BiPAP requirements with some flash pulmonary edema, even with really moderate changes in his blood pressure. So then my partner at the time, Mark Reisman, actually did a MitraClip. And long story short, this guy had temporary dialysis, 3 kind of fairly complicated procedures. He was there for about 20 days. But ultimately, he did well. And so I think the other takeaway from this case to me is part of the lesson here is persistence. It's really easy to kind of write these things off as it starts to not go well. So overall, I think when I look back, certainly it's important to plan for as much as you can. I struggle more in these cases because you have to recognize when your initial plan was maybe a bad one. I think, trying to do the right thing for the right reasons is important, but getting help is just as much so. And then finally, I think we all are a product of our training. So certainly if I had more experience with vein graft interventions, I might have done that instead, and probably many of you would have. But there's probably cases where, both sides of that are advantageous. So thanks for your time.